What are the things when we say that only I can do, that I must do to do my mission, but what will pull me down? I've got to be aware of those. And it may be something very tactical that you're going to delegate, but then all of a sudden you got to be up to speed quickly because it's hit the press. And how are you going to handle that? Thinking through that ahead of time. You got to empower that staff. You can delegate, but if you keep watching over their shoulder, they won't feel empowered. Making sure they know they have been empowered and here are their bounds.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we'll explore an essential leadership principle that can make or break your team's success: delegation. Delegation is a leadership skill that truly separates great leaders from good ones. I'm honored to welcome a truly great leader, General Frank Grass, to the podcast to discuss why delegation is not just important, it's imperative. General Grass completed 47 years of military service, culminating in serving as the 27th Chief of the National Guard Bureau, overseeing approximately 450,000 National Guard personnel and serving on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You'll definitely gain from his insights on delegation and how we can be better at doing it. General, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that introduction.
Well, jumping right into our topic today, when we talked before, when I asked you a leadership lesson you learned the hard way, you said the biggest one was prioritization of time and effort, and you went on to frame that as the ability to delegate appropriately. I always like to make sure we define our terms on the podcast. So when you think about this idea, what does delegation mean to you, or what does it look like?
Okay. Well, first of all, I just finished watching the memorial for our President Jimmy Carter, and I did want to just take a moment and talk about great leaders, and he was one, both in as a political leader, but then also tremendous work after. So I salute him today and just wanted to put that out. When I think of delegation and I look back at my career from very tactical level, and then when I say tactical, platoon leader level, responsible as a lieutenant for about 30 men and women, and then all the way to strategic in my last job, where I was on the Joint Chiefs and we were making recommendations to the Secretary of Defense for all types of activities and future force and vision of the force and recommendations, to the Secretary that would go up to the President in many cases. When you think about delegation, when you move into those types of jobs, you got to figure out where you fit and what can be done by someone else. As a good friend of mine says, only do the things that you must do. Rich Galant, Major General retired, he was the Chief of Staff out in North Carolina. He and I continue to do some mentoring work together. And he tells every class, only do the things that you must do if you want to be successful. I think it starts with this whole understanding of what is delegation. It starts with you. Who are you as a person? How do you delegate? And of course, I was an engineer officer, construction, combat engineer, and I was very detailed. I love spreadsheets. When you become a general, you got to break away from that. As you move up in the ranks, even before general, you got to figure out, okay, I knew I was very detail oriented, but in my own mind, I knew I had to have more time to do the things I was responsible for as I moved up through ranks. So I think that's the first thing, understanding who you are and how you lead, because you may need to really do some self reflection and figure out, okay, how am I going to change? What are the things I need to caution myself against? The next one is, what is your mission? What will fail if you as a person, as a leader, don't accomplish what will the organization fail in? And then the last part of that, I think, is understanding the context you're working in. And the context over my career, and as you know, Tom, it's gotten very, very complex because information that might be very tactical, very low level, that could be handled by young men and women, no matter what organization you're leading, now in a moment's notice reaches everybody in the world, through mass media. And that context can pull you back down when you're really supposed to stay at the strategic level. And then how do you do that? So that was probably, the keys that I had to learn and evaluate myself. I will give you an example, though. When I was a lieutenant colonel, and this was very a very good lesson for me. Again, engineer, doing all the great things that we love to do. We all like hands-on. I had been enlisted as an equipment operator. And we got a mission, very short notice mission, to go to Honduras and run an exercise for about 8 months after Hurricane Mitch devastated much of Honduras. And my engineer battalion was going to go down and do 3 rotations at 2 weeks at a time. So I went down and spent most of the time. But in the planning effort, when I got out there, I realized that I had missions scattered over 100 miles of the eastern part of Honduras. And there was no way that I was going to be able to be at every site.
Sure.
Even though I wanted to be, I knew I couldn't. So I knew I had to put faith and confidence in folks across my staff that I knew could work in this very austere environment. I mean, maybe some areas we couldn't even communicate. I'd have to give them basic guidance and say, hey, I'll see you in 3 days. Go get the mission accomplished. Here's your mission. And I had a civil engineer, actually, I had two civil engineers. One actually a civilian job. He worked for Walmart, and he was a land developer for Walmart, and very complex, purchasing
Mhm.
land all the way through a building on it. And I thought, here's the guy we need. And so we picked him to go out and do the preliminary planning on each of the sites and just delegate it. And I said, Stuart, you just let me know if you need anything, get in touch with me, but you got the mission. I'll be
Mhm.
out to check on you once in a while. And he did a fabulous job. But then when it came to the execution of the mission, we had some sergeants, non-commissioned officers that were in the construction trades in civilian life. And we had some very difficult roads and bridges to rebuild. I mean, they were completely wiped out. And these non-commissioned officers, we gave them basic guidance. The engineer gave them the plan, and they executed the mission.
Mhm.
In fact, when I got out there, really wasn't anything for me to do, so I jumped in and started helping place some concrete, just to lead by example.
Yeah.
But I think that was the key: knowing who you had that had the expertise.
Right.
Because sometimes, even though they may be in the military role, they may be able to do that. Maybe they've never done it.
Yeah.
These men and women that I selected for these positions had all done it, in civilian life as well as the
Mhm.
military. So that was the key: right person, right mix. I had trust in them, and they executed the mission.
Yeah. I think that you hit on one thing that's really important with delegation, from my perspective, is this issue of trust. And we've talked about that so much on this podcast. But you got to know your people, which you said, right? Like you knew these people and they had capabilities. Identify the right people for the job. Trust that they can do the job that you know they can do, and then don't micromanage. Don't get in the way. Don't continue to try to do their job. I mean, if it's delegation, it's delegation. You've given that to them. You trust they're going to do it, and you let them do it. So for you, being in the Guard, obviously, you had those people who had those extra capabilities. As a former guardsman myself, there were so many people, especially folks who were in enlisted positions, who might, outside of the Guard, have all these MBAs and all sorts of things that weren't necessarily reflected in their military, rank and so forth, but brought so much more to the table. And recognizing that and understanding the capabilities you have to be able to deploy them, I think is so valuable when it comes to leadership and delegation, especially.
Yes, I actually, some of the folks that you interviewed, a lot of them are good friends of mine, and I remember one of them. I won't give his name, but he had told me once that when he was commanding during the War on Terror, he said when he would get a reserve or National Guard unit showing up, first thing he asked for is a book for their civilian skills, because there were so many things that were in his mission set in the War on Terror in the Middle East that he needed skill sets: reestablish water, reestablish highways, put up the electric grid, things like
Building
that.
schools, all sorts of
Yeah,
things. Yeah, yeah.
it
Well,
goes back to understanding who you have, what their skill sets are, and that you have trust that they'll execute that mission.
one thing that came to mind, that was a great example of being able to delegate, and that was easy, and folks took it and ran with it and were very successful in the process. But I think there are probably times, certainly, where it's not as easy. I guess that delegation is hard, whether from the leader's perspective or from the fact that the personnel's perspective. But do you have an example maybe of a situation where it was challenging to delegate, and how to overcome that?
Yes, let me just jump into the role as a JCS. As coming in as a new member, General Craig McKinley, Air Guard out of Florida, had been the chief for a total of 4 years before I stepped in. And his last year, he served on the Joint Chiefs. And that was the new position for the National Guard. And he told me when I walked in, he says, this organization's got to change. We're dealing at a whole different level, and our nation expects much faster information from the state to the federal so we can take care of our people out there. So your role is going to be that communication, chain of communication between the state's adjutants general and the governor up to the Secretary of Defense and on to the president. And that was a big change because before that, before the Senate put the National Guard and the Joint Chiefs, we were buried 3 or 4 levels down. And by the time in fact, about one of the first crises I worked was Superstorm Sandy. And I was sitting there one day and thinking, okay, so before we were on the Joint Chiefs, we were buried down at this level. And by the time the information got to the secretary, who knows what was said by who. And here I am sitting with him almost every day, briefing him and the chairman before they head over for a meeting at the White House, with the principals. I realized the value, but I knew I had to change. My organization had to change. And thanks to Craig for giving me that guidance. I would say that the big thing I learned really quickly in that role was when you get inside the beltway of DC, and I used to say that's not reality. Reality is in hometown America. But the bureaucracy is a bureaucracy for a reason. I mean, you don't want everybody yanking everybody's chain in each direction. But But things that happen inside our nation's capital now, with the mass media, with the instantaneous, with very little context of what's really happening, can yank you around big time as a senior
Mhm.
leader. And you've got to figure out, how do I step above that? As the new guy on board, I constantly had to struggle of getting pulled down into what I had delegated to others to do. General Grass, give us the numbers of MREs that are sitting on the ramp, at such and such an airport to go. I didn't worry about that. I
Right.
tried to pull them up and say, wait a minute, what does that mean to you? And this was a lot of the senior, military and civilian, because they were all getting pressure from the very
Mhm.
highest levels of government to move things. I said, you need to focus on, are people being fed, not how many MREs, because 1,000 boxes of MREs is not going to feed New York City.
Right.
Maybe 4 or 5 million, okay, but you're not. What you really want to know is, what is the crux of the problem, and are the needs, as Craig Fugate, my former partner there at FEMA, said, you know, what are the unmet needs? But in that scenario, you get pulled down. In some cases,
Mhm.
well-intended people that don't understand, and they haven't really put a lot of context. They're just crisis of seeing, whatever the local news is saying. So that was something I had to learn quick as a new member of the Joint Chiefs, and try to pull everyone up. Even meetings with the secretary, at times people would try to pull him down. Luckily, the first secretary I worked for, and I worked for three different ones, Secretary Leon Panetta, just a fun. Everyone I worked for were phenomenal leaders. And of course, he had had a lot of experience in the CIA, many years in the Senate, almond farmer out in California. You could almost tell when he looked at you, like, hey, you're diving too deep, pull up, pull up. He wouldn't even have to say it.
Yeah.
He was just that kind of guy. So I think that was a big lesson, is people will try to pull you down in today's world more than ever, just
Yeah.
because the information's out there.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. That's good insight, and that's helpful to put it in that context. I do recall you mentioning before we talked this idea that people would get wrapped around the axle about a certain number, and if you said a number, then if it didn't match, of course, then that was a storm too. So I appreciate that. You said something just a minute ago that's very similar to something that one of our recent guests, General Ed Rice, whom you may know, had said, and that was doing only what only you can do. And so, certainly, I think a major key of that's being able to delegate appropriately, which is why you brought it up. But as we talk about this, and I think about, like, when I was training in medicine, we called it scut work, which means having to do the jobs that nobody else wants to do. So I was wondering, can you delineate for us the difference between delegation, appropriate delegation, and what might be called dumping? So basically, this idea of the difference between delegating things to others and just dumping the unwanted and difficult things on them. How do you differentiate those?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's something you have to really spend some time thinking about when you take over an organization, at any level, because the results are the people are going to execute the mission. If they feel they're being dumped on, they don't feel value added in the organization. And I think what you really have to look at across the board in any level, again, tactical through strategic, is what are you trying to accomplish? What must you accomplish in your position? And then what can be done by someone else? And when I say someone else, this is not degrading to anyone in the organization. We in the military, as you know, it's a team effort. Whether it's the communications guy that's working on a fighter pilot's helmet, to the guy that's, putting a weapon system on that thing, to the guy that's flying it, or to the air traffic control. It's all part of the team. And you've got to make everybody feel a part of that team. And what we did, especially as a new member of the Joint Chief, there were some things we had to do that, could be considered dumping. But what we did is we brought the team in at the senior levels and said, okay, let's look at this and figure out, what are the mundane things we do, and do we have to do them, first of all? Because
Yeah.
you find sometimes that people just continue to do it because they always have. Is
Right.
it feeding to the ultimate goal and mission success of the unit? If it's not, okay, let's figure out a better way to do it. And oh, by the way, I'd have my senior staff there, but I said, you need to go back and talk to the people that do this work, or that will be doing it, and let them participate. And that input from them will be hugely valuable as you move forward. Because if it's their idea, they're going to be much more willing to support it. So that's kind of how we handled a lot of those things. And there were a lot of mundane tasks that we had to throw away. I mean, and incorporate into other areas. When we moved from the chief of the National Guard Bureau's office of Air and Army Guard, up to the JCS role, so we had
Mhm.
to review all of that documentation. There were things in there, and I would say everyone ought, at least every year or two, go back through the establishment of their organization and see what's current. And maybe now in today's world, because things are moving so quickly, we ought to do it at least once a year. Now, how we handled that, we would take all the senior staff from the Air National Guard. This was personnel, logistics, operations, intel, and the leadership, and all from the Army National Guard, and sit down with them with the National Guard Bureau staff. We did it about twice a year, and we would review where we were on our path to having success as being a member of the Joint Chiefs. And usually we try to bring someone in also from the States, our customers. What were they seeing that might be different than what we saw? Because the States, I mean, there was no reason for us to exist if it wasn't for the States. And the 54, we call them. So that's one way of dealing with it. And then there are things you just have to do. And then you find the right person that wants to do it. And within any organization, people are people. We all have different personalities and different skill sets. And you'll find some people, and I think I even mentioned this when you interviewed me about the delegation of records. Now that's a tough one. I mean, who wants to deal with records? But it's an
Right.
amazingly important part to feed the history of the organization. And we found a person that just loved dealing with records and was very, very good at it.
Yeah.
And then we found also by putting that person in charge of the records over time, we found out how we could incorporate that into lessons learned that could be shared across the staff. So we didn't repeat previous previous mistakes sometimes.
Yeah. Sort of reminds me of one man's trash is another man's treasure. Well, I think we've kind of ironed out what delegation looks like. From your perspective, why is delegation important? Like as leaders, why do we need to master delegation?
I put a lot of thought into this question because I probably wasn't always the best at it, especially going back to being a micromanager as an engineer and coming through that process. But what I would say, what is most important is as a leader, you're going to be making decisions, and timing is so critical. You can make the best decision in the world, but if it's made late, your accomplishment is degraded in many ways. So I think it's the timing that you have to do the things you need to do. And if you can delegate some of that off of your plate to others that can do it, as you move up too, as General Shinseki, former chief staff of the Army, told, I was in a 1-star group at the time, and he told us all, he says, get to about the 80% solution, you're just going to keep getting flooded with more and more information. But if you get to about the 80% of the information that you think is available at hand, make a decision, because he says your gut will carry you through. You didn't get to this position, by accident. You've learned, you've had the scars, and just don't wait for the 100%. And actually, I've seen this a number of times, especially in subordinate units, commanders. They will wait and miss an opportunity to make a decision. So the timing is so important, and that's why delegating that, and having more time to do the things you need to do, again, to accomplish the mission in the end.
Yeah. General Dempsey talked a lot about the importance of having time to think as a leader. If you're doing everybody else's job for them, you don't have time to think as a leader, and so you don't have that really needed resource of time to do what may be the most important thing that you could be doing as a leader. So
yeah, there was something I'll follow up with, I think, that's very important, and it's in grooming the staff. I always used to tell my staff, before you elevate something to the next level, before it hits my desk, have you stepped back and see and taken a look at, have you done everything within your authority and your power to fix this problem before you take it to the next level? Because I found mainly at the mid-grade, when I was a major lieutenant colonel and became a branch chief for overseas deployments, and there were a lot of folks that would want to come up and line up at your office door and ask you questions that they really need to be answering. Now, you don't want to tick them off, but you got to educate, you got to work them. And I found that, most of them, there were a few that probably didn't need to be at that level for whatever reason, but the majority, once you empowered them, especially at the lieutenant captain level, senior civilian coming through, that they had the authority within bounds to make a decision and to move a product forward or a decision. It turned out pretty good. But at times, I think, especially in the first 6 months of any job, they don't know who you are in a lot of cases. You've stepped into the role, and they don't know where they stand with you. So they'll want to bounce things off of you. And the sooner you get them feeling, hey, he trusts me or she trusts me, then the better off you are.
Yeah. As I think about this idea of delegating and why it's important that we've been hitting on, for me, it kind of boils down to this really very simple reality of if I spend my time doing all the things that someone else is doing, could be doing, should be doing, I won't have the time to do the things I'm supposed to be doing, the thinking, the planning, the encouraging, the empowering, those things that you were saying, and developing those people, just as you were mentioning, to be able to do those tasks that they need to be doing. So I think that just for me is so simple. Like, you only have a certain amount of time as anybody, whether leader or otherwise. And so if you're doing everybody else's job, you can't do your own.
You mentioned General Dempsey, General Marty
Yes, sir.
Dempsey. Worked with him for 3 years, and then the last year was with General Joe Dunford. Marty said something to the JCS when I was fairly new to it, And it just stuck in my mind. I share it now anytime I speak with senior officers. And he says, we on the JCS have limited amount of time to come together, because the JCS is made up of the chairman, the vice, and the others, except, well, I was chief of the National Guard, so I had the Army and Air, but then each of the service chiefs had a full-time, full plate. And he goes, here's what I want you to keep in mind when we meet. And usually we met on Mondays and Fridays. And it was to be updated. Some cases it was just updating us on what was happening. Others were discussions about recommendations, no matter what the topic was, that were going up to the Secretary of Defense. And he said, think of, as you prioritize your effort, you as a JCS member and as a leader of your organization, think in terms of survival of the nation. He said, that's really why we're here. And he says, the second thing I want you to think about is security of the nation. He goes, now, I don't mean to belittle security, but he says, we've been at war. And then by the time I went in 2012, so it was 11 years after 9/11. He said, we have been consumed by security of the nation. He says, what I mean is, we were attacked and a lot of Americans died, God rest their souls. But it's pulled us into this discussion about security and fighting, organizations around the world, terrorist organizations around the world that would like to see us wiped off the face of the earth. But he says they never will. They can kill a lot of people, but they will never wipe us off the face. So he says, put that in perspective. Now, again, this is the 2012-13 timeframe when we started shifting to the Pacific. He says, now I want you to think about peer adversaries that do have the capability, and in some leaders who have the intent that they would prefer to see us as a third world, as a not one of the world's leaders. And he says, so I want you to think first about survival of the nation. And that stuck with me, and it still sticks with me today of our effort, because there were a lot of things. Yes, we can't let terrorism define who we are. And we've got people that are very good at that business. I mean, the FBI, if the American people could see what the FBI does every day, it's phenomenal. So we as a military need to focus on those huge peer military adversaries, and how do we deter them from ever wanting to take us off the map? And again, I think when you talk about delegation, that helps kind of, okay, hey, staff, I know we got a bunch of deployments coming up. You got that. I'm going to be focusing and working with the adjutant generals. And what are we going to do if we get attacked in the homeland? Do we have an organization? In fact, we have a lot of these discussions right now with some teaching I do for Northern Command and National Guard on senior leaders. Are we prepared, whether it's a non-kinetic, turn the lights off to half of America now for 3 weeks? We'd be in chaos. Do we have a plan?
Right.
So it helped me focus on what was important, which then drives the whole idea. I've got to take something off my plate. What is it? So prioritization.
Yeah, I think that's valuable and important. And I think a lot of people suffer from an inability to prioritize. That's been my observation. As I think about the science and what people have found when they have studied this idea of delegation, effective delegation, it turns out it's beneficial for the leader as well as for those who are being led. So studies have shown that delegation actually prevents burnout and allows them more space just for what we've been talking about, strategic thinking. And that's both of those are highly valuable if we're going to be effective leaders, especially with burnout being rampant like it is across our nation at this point in time. So those are two very important things that have been shown in studies. But I think it's really important also because people who are listening may think, well, and it's just the same with this idea of dumping, right? Well, if I'm delegating to people, they're not going to appreciate that. It's not going to be good for them. They're just whatever. But it turns out that's not the case at all. So studies have actually shown that when we as leaders delegate effectively, it benefits the entire team. I'll provide some references and things in the show notes and that, but studies have shown that when leaders are skilled at delegating, their teams experience higher degrees of trust, better collaboration, and increased innovation. So delegation, when it's really done well, is truly a win-win for leaders and their teams.
Yeah, and I think along with delegation, again, as a senior leader, you have limited amount of time. But if you can get out, and we did this intentionally when I was the chief, and I did it probably throughout my career. It's just who I am. I enjoy engaging with people. But as the chief, we would do 2 trips a year, usually hinged around Middle East or Afghanistan or Africa, to visit our troops. And it'd be 6 or 7 days out of my schedule, but we would go out and I'd walk with the troops. I'd go out and just have a conversation with them. When you talk about mundane tasks, sometimes a person that's sitting there repairing the tire on a 5-ton truck, and a 4-star walks up to him. I mean, that spreads like wildfire across the organization that, hey, they really care about what I do. You're part of the team. That truck's going nowhere, and the people are going to ride on it, or whatever weapon system's going nowhere unless you fix that thing. So I think that's the other thing about delegation. You've got to carve out time. And of course, by delegating, you can carve out some time, and you got to go out and see folks at all levels. It's kind of amazing. I've been retired 8 years. I still go to promotions, retirements, things like that, and people will come up. A young sergeant. Well, now they're older sergeants because this was quite a while back,
Sure.
or a major said, "Hey, you took time to come and see me at this place where I was happy to leave many years ago. That we were doing a mission that he said it's just that being there with us makes a difference. And I think that's part of delegation. If you're going to give them a mundane task or you're going to give them a tough task, many of these tasks that we do today are very tough, that you got to go see them. You got
Yeah.
to shake their hands and thank them.
Yeah.
And in any organization, I had a governor tell me once, he hired an adjutant general to be his secretary of transportation. And this was a very large state. And we were at a governor's event. And he says, he says, first time that we had a secretary of transportation in our state that went out and visited every facility. He said, I started getting reports from people out there that said, nobody ever came and saw us before. And it just built the morale and built the
Yeah.
willingness of them to take on more.
Yeah.
So you got to get out there as a senior leader and shake hands.
Yeah.
And you will probably learn things that you may not have known.
Right. Good or bad, but yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm hearing from you is showing appreciation for people who are out there doing the tasks, who are taking care of business day in and day out, appreciating them, empowering them, trusting them. So many important things that go into this that are valuable for us.
Yes, definitely.
I imagine, for some of our listeners, the idea of delegating may make sense, but it may seem, kind of, I mentioned this earlier, difficult to do. There may be circumstances where it's difficult, and you hit on a few things earlier, but to bring it back to the practical on this, what practical advice do you have for them to be better at delegating, to really master this idea?
Sure. And I'm sure you could probably ask a lot of different senior leaders and you'd get a lot of answers, but I think some of the things would be very similar. And I think it's a great way to share this information, through the podcast, because I had to kind of learn it on the fly.
Yeah.
I had to learn it, that it was important that, my tasks were overwhelming at times and I
Sure.
wasn't always getting done the things I needed to do. And I think kind of, if you think about a 5-step process, and you could vary it, whatever fits for your mode of operation. But starting out with knowing who you are as you move up to different positions. Are you a micromanager like I was? Okay, I've got to watch that myself. I'm the only one that can fix that. Or am I, too much delegated? To where I don't know what's going on in the organization. You got to find that balance, and it really starts with knowing who you are.
Mm-hmm.
The next one is your mission. What is your mission? And it goes back to what we've been talking about is what do I have to accomplish to do my mission? What can I do, and what can go to others? So, knowing yourself, knowing the mission, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky at times. What are the things when we say that only I can do, that I must do to do my mission, but what will pull me down? I've got to be aware of those. And it may be something very tactical that you're going to delegate, but then all of a sudden you got to be up to speed quickly because it's hit the press. And how are you going to handle that? Thinking through that ahead of time. And how are you going to understand when that happens? Who's going to tell you? So those are the first three. And then the next one is you got to empower that staff. You can delegate, but if you keep watching over their shoulder, they won't feel empowered. So that's probably the fourth one is making sure they know they have been empowered and here are their bounds. If it hits this trigger, you need to pass it up to the next level, or at least make sure I'm aware. Other than that, you make the decisions. And the whole thing is then trust but verify. And I go back to Ronald Reagan. I think this was actually a Russian proverb years ago. And but Ronald Reagan said, "Trust but verify," and that goes along with the visits. You're out there, you're verifying the missions. You're hearing from the soldiers. Maybe there's something they don't have that they need, or you're within your organization. So, and I think trust but verify also gives you more confidence to do more delegation.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of the 5 things that I would think about.
Yeah, I think those are excellent. I really like the way that you brought those together. I think certainly in that moment, I'm learning. Part of this is so I can continue learning as well as helping other people learn and develop. But so that's definitely good. As I was thinking about it, and what are the things out there in the literature that people have identified and so forth. There are a few more that I can add from the science. One, and we hit on this already, but I like to bring it all together for folks who are listening so they have action items. Determine the right people with the necessary competence. And that goes back to your very first example where you're talking about that. The second is, we talked about this, set clear expectations. If you don't tell people what you want to do, want to have happen, you were talking about it in the form of the mission. Know what the mission is. Tell them what the mission is and set the expectations. Another thing that is out there in the literature is don't delegate the negatives and keep all the positives. When people see that, then they feel like you're dumping on them, like we were hitting on. And so an example might be don't make everybody else deliver bad news. There are some people in positions who would say, "Hey, you're the person who fires everybody," right? And that's just not cool. That's not a good thing to do, and so that's really a negative. The fourth thing is delegate things that actually fall into people's roles. You don't want to give people something to do that is outside their skill set or their role or things like that, because then that sends a message that bad on a lot of levels. So that's not a good one. We talked about empowering your people, and that really means give them the resources, the authority. People, when I did the study of you all, the 4 stars, so often I heard delegate authority, retain responsibility. So if you give them all the things that they need, authority and so forth, to get the mission done, if something goes sideways, that's on you. You keep that, because that's really important. The sixth thing was, and this as a person who is a self-proclaimed micromanager, engineer, this might be one to think about. Be willing to let go of perfection. It's okay if they don't do it exactly like you would do it or things like that. If it gets done, that's really valuable. And then the seventh one is limit the potential consequences to your people. Again, that gets back to this idea of delegate authority but retain responsibility. Any thoughts on any of those, sir?
Wow. Yeah, no, that is right on track. I think the one thing in today's world, and I probably need to put a lot more thought to this over time, but the context of what we're dealing with in today's world, because of the mass media and immediate information, is weeding through a lot of that and protecting your staff. Part of the, taking responsibility. And I think even in your book, you talk about how in some cases when things did go bad, even though they had delegated responsibility, the blame came to the top guy. And that's who it always should come.
Yeah.
But you got to realize the context of the world today has changed. I would say a little C for context when I started my career, because you can mess up and, you can fix it and move on. Well, today, something very, a private could do something in the streets of America
Right.
that would immediately send a signal all the way through our government and internationally.
Yeah.
And you got to keep that in the back of your mind. And then you got to make people, because I think we're growing a society, some of these folks that do understand context, and they're afraid to make a decision because they know, hey, it might be on the nightly news.
Sure.
And how do you take that and make sure you just got to move on. If it goes bad, I'll take it for you.
Yeah.
Now, what we did on the JCS at times, and again, this is this is kind of a side note in a bit, but there'd be something on the news, and one of the services or the chief of the guard would have said something, or something happening way out in the field in a very tactical level role, and it'd be all over the press. And we'd walk in for a meeting and we'd look at that guy or gal and say, "Oh, so you're in the spotlight today." And we'd all start chuckling. And he goes, "Hey, don't worry, it's 24 hours. Tomorrow will be one of you."
Right.
But you had to be prepared for that and take that on and just make sure that the American people, what they heard from their leadership is that, hey, yes, we have a problem. We're taking it on. We're going to try to fix it. And I accept responsibility for this.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
follow up to show what you are doing to fix problems.
Yeah. Well, I'm reminded of Admiral Scott Swift. He was commander of the Pacific Fleet, and he in the Navy, and he was just recently on the podcast. And his career, the reason that, and this happens, folks that know about the Navy know that if there's a collision or a ship is run aground, it doesn't matter what circumstances under which that occurs. It's just a Navy thing that heads roll. For Admiral Swift, there were 2 ships thousands of miles away from him. They were operating, under their own guidance, and they had a collision, and that was on him as the person who was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. And folks can talk about whether that's fair or not, and I don't actually think that it is, but anyway, that's an example of what we're talking about there, I think.
Yeah. And when I first pinned on a star, a very good friend of mine gave me some great advice. He said, you're gonna have some tough decisions. You're gonna have all the opportunities of the world to do things and see things, but you're gonna have to make some tough decisions at times. And he says, if you ever cross the line, or you begin to think you're going to cross the line of something you're being told to do that's wrong or against the Constitution, be ready to throw your stars on the table. He goes, and don't just use that as a threat. It's got to be something very serious. And I think that comes along with the responsibility. And in history, a number of our senior leaders, for whatever reason, disagreed with a very strategic decision, and they were willing to say, "Hey, I need to step aside because I can't support this." And it's a tough. But I think for the most part, people understand. We are in a dangerous business in the military, as well as fire and police chiefs and
Sure.
around the world, and you've got to take that responsibility and make a decision how you're going to correct it, and then let the world know. That's the big thing, is because that's going to be the blame game, through the press of wanting to know. Well, What are you doing to fix it? And same way on the Hill. I mean, a number of times of things that I did that I got called up during testimony to say, okay, what are you doing to fix this? But I will tell you, for the most part, whenever I had to deal with an issue, an example, one year we were going to run short of drill pay because one of the captains down at the very lowest levels had made a mistake in tracking dollars within the budget office. And I took responsibility. I went to the appropriators on the Hill. They drilled me, which intentionally they should. And I told them what we were doing, and I asked for their help, and they helped me, and we fixed it so that everyone could get paid that year. The Hill wanted to know, they wanted someone to accept the responsibility that something had gone wrong, because they appropriated those funds so that every 450,000 could drill in September.
Yeah.
Again, I laid out, not the captain, I laid out, hey, here's what we've done. Here's what I need from you, because we weren't running out of money. It was just in the wrong pots.
Yeah.
And they understood. I think that's the other thing. If you tell people, for the most part, if you tell them what the issue is and what you're doing to fix it and how they can help, especially, when you're dealing with the Congress,
Mm-hmm.
they may want a little ounce of flesh, but beyond that, they're going to do everything they can to help you. They want you to be successful.
Wow. I appreciate that story. I have a vague recollection of that, because you were the chief of the guard when I was still in, and so I remember that time, actually.
What was crazy about it, we were sitting in a meeting, and one of our attorneys came up and he goes, this is September. He says, so what's important? We all have to have a good retirement year. We have to have enough drill points and annual training points and active duty points to have a good retirement year. He said, we have so many people doing extra days now. He says, we ought to check with the adjutant generals and find out how many. And it came out to like 4% of the guard needed to actually drill in September. And a lot of them said, hey, I'll be happy to take a few days off. But we wanted, that was an entitlement that they should get, and they did.
Yeah. Well, sir, before we wrap up, I was wondering, with today's technology and the fast-paced communication, you hit on this a little bit, and maybe this is maybe it's just that is your answer, but are there new challenges or opportunities with regard to delegation that leaders should be considering?
Yes. About 8 times a year, I go out to Fort Leavenworth and I support a course. I do a 2-hour class, and it's on knowledge management. And these are mid-grade civilians. We actually have some international folks come in, and then mid-grade officers, warrant officers, and sergeants. And one of the things I stress with them, and it's about knowledge management. We're being flooded. How do you put that into decision quality decisions? But I tell them, you've got to do some study of generations, because all of this, we're all being affected. And I go from me as a baby boomer, the most technology I had in Fox High School in Orno, Missouri was, an electric typewriter, to my granddaughter who takes my iPhone at 5 years old, and starts looking through the pictures.
Yeah.
It's the mindset, and some of their strengths and weaknesses in each generation, and you go through that, and you've got to understand that when you run an organization, because the baby boomers are very, we're just off the scale when it comes to technology, of understanding how to even use it. We just don't know. To all the way to like my granddaughter's generation, which I guess is alpha now.
Yeah.
You can look at 5 or 6 screens and do all kinds of things.
All right.
But if you understand those cultures, it will help you then when you assign people to different positions, when you consider them for promotions. Can they move beyond what may be weaknesses? Not any fault of theirs. It's just part of the culture they're growing up in. And I look at some of my grandchildren of, if it's on the internet, it must be true. Not so fast. So those things across the board, I think understanding generational changes, and there's some great stuff out there, that you can look at that corporations have done, looking at this as they consider and groom people for positions. I think this all fits into the whole concept of leadership and delegation and functioning and organization that can make things happen.
Yeah. Well, Jim Grass, I think, it's been great to have you on here. Real pleasure. Thank you for being on Science Leadership, sir.
Well, Tom, thank you. As a professor of pediatrics and working on, incredibly challenging physical issues that our young children will deal with in their lives, you've dedicated, I was just floored when I realized, what you did as a civilian, and then to bring that into the leadership realm. Thank you very much. The book is just impressive.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to it coming out hopefully this summer. And you all definitely get signed copies.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.